This is a continuation of lesson 1.1 on arguments. And last time we discussed what an argument is, that it's offering a reason to believe something, and that reason is called a premise. Now I want to call your attention to some potential relationships between the premises of an argument. We can make a distinction between premises that are independent of one another versus premises that are dependent of one another. Or sometimes the term linked is used to describe the dependent premises, and I think that's the term that's used in the textbook. Take a look at example 3. You shouldn't be afraid of snakes. Most snakes are not poisonous, and they don't bite unless provoked. Now take a few seconds and see if you can identify the conclusion of this argument. It's you shouldn't be afraid of snakes. You can tell this is the conclusion. Imagine asking the person, why shouldn't I be? Can you give me a reason? You can tell that they've offered these other statements as reasons not to be afraid of snakes. Notice how if you ask for a reason to believe one of these other statements, they haven't offered anything, right? Imagine asking, most snakes are not poisonous. How do you know that? They haven't said how they know that most snakes are not poisonous, or how they know that they don't bite unless provoked. But if you said, why shouldn't I be afraid of snakes, then it makes sense that they would be offering, most snakes are not poisonous. And secondly, that they don't bite unless provoked. So we have two premises here. And notice how there's one sentence that contains both premises. But I define a premise as a statement in support of a conclusion that's offered as a reason to believe a conclusion, not a sentence. So there's more than one statement here, even though there's only one sentence. So those are two premises. And actually, I need to digress for a minute because this example brings up a couple of important misconceptions about arguments. First, the conclusion doesn't have to come at the end. If you were thinking it couldn't be the conclusion because it's at the beginning, that's a mistake. Conclusion for us doesn't mean ending. It's something a person offers a reason to believe. So in this example, the person announces the conclusion at the beginning, and that's very common. The conclusion could come at the end, but it could also be the first statement someone makes, or it could be in the middle. It could be sandwiched between premises or between premises and other kinds of information. The second misconception is that you may have gotten the idea from somewhere that there's a topic restriction when it comes to arguments, that certain kinds of statements can't be argued. And if you didn't correctly identify the conclusion of this argument, that might be why. Sometimes people say, you can't give an argument about my emotional reaction to something, my emotional reaction to snakes, or about my subjective preference not to be around snakes, that I hate them. However, if you look back at our definition of arguments, let me just scroll back to this. We said that an argument has a premise, has a conclusion, at least one premise, and a premise has to be something that's offered as a reason to believe something. So it doesn't say anything about it has to be a certain kind of topic. There's absolutely no topic restriction when it comes to what the conclusion of an argument could be. It's just offering a premise as a reason to believe something. So I can offer a reason to believe any kind of statement whatsoever. I can offer a reason that you shouldn't be afraid of snakes. Or I can offer a reason, that you should have a certain emotional reaction. You should be excited to see snakes, or I can argue for something that's a matter of sort of personal preference. Someone says, there's an old saying, there's no arguing for taste, and you can see that's wrong. You can give an argument for something that's taste. I can give an argument that for example, sushi is better than pasta. I can say sushi has to taste better than pasta if you think about it, because sushi comes from an island, whereas pasta comes from a peninsula, and island food is always better than peninsula food. So I've made it clear that I'm offering those statements as reasons to believe, that sushi tastes better than pasta. Now you might say, oh, you're not going to convince anyone that way. You're not going to change someone's preference by giving an argument like this. Or you might say it can't be a good argument or something like. Remember, that's not what we're talking about here. We're just talking about what makes it an argument. And since it's just an offering, there's no topic restriction. So we'll leave it for another debate whether there could ever be a good argument about something like this. But you certainly can just give an argument. All that means is that you're offering something. So it's an argument because I declared my intention to prove something. Now, back to independent versus dependent premises. In this argument, each premise is providing its own reason to believe the conclusion. It's like there's two separate arguments here. One, that they're not poisonous, and then the other, that they don't bite unless provoked. You could imagine asking the person questions. That's by the way, that's very helpful sometimes. Imagine asking the person certain questions. Can you give me a reason to believe I shouldn't be afraid of snakes? And then you can see that they've offered most are not poisonous. And then if you asked, can you give me another reason? I'm happy with the snakes not being poisonous, but can you give me another reason? Then it looks like they have also offered they don't bite unless provoked. So that's it's like a separate argument for the conclusion. So we have independent premises. Now I'm going to give you an example of what I'm calling dependent premises. I'm going to start by leaving one of the premises out. So here's an example, example 4. I'm going to Toronto, therefore I'll be in Canada. Now I left a premise out. There's something I didn't say, but you can tell what it is. It's an assumption that's involved, and it gets you from I'm going to Toronto to therefore I'll be in Canada. Let's put some space between those. You can imagine filling in the gap here. What gets you from here to what gets you from here down to here? It might be easier if I make it something more obscure, actually. Then you'll see the assumption, right? So if I say I'm going to Tullinahaw, right? And probably most people know what Tullinahaw is. So I say I'm going to Tullinahaw, and that means I'll be in Cavan. So now, what's the assumption that gets me from point A to point B here? Isn't it that Tullinahaw is in Cavan? Tullinahaw is in Cavan. So let's put that in there. That's the premise that I didn't say, but you could tell it's part of this argument, right? So now let's think about the relationship between these premises. This time it's different because they aren't independent of one another. It's not like one reason to believe I'll be in Cavan is because Tullinahaw is in Cavan, and then another completely separate reason is that I'll be in Tullinahaw. Those, like, they're two separate arguments. Go back to asking the person questions. Imagine we ask, can you give me a reason to believe you'll be in Cavan? And maybe the person would say, well, I'll be in Tullinahaw. And you wouldn't have to ask this because it's obvious. You wouldn't say this. You just figure it out. But never mind that. If you did ask, what's that got to do with the conclusion? How does that get you from this premise down to this conclusion, right? If we didn't have the middle, right? And you said, I'm going to Tullinahaw, therefore I'll be in Cavan. And if you asked, how do you get from that premise to that conclusion, then it would make sense that the person says, because Tullinahaw is in Cavan, right? So now, when you have those premises, when you have those statements both together, even though maybe you don't need to say one of them, they're dependent premises. Another test you can apply is the following. Imagine saying the opposite of one of the premises. If they're dependent premises, the argument won't make sense. It'll be absurd, or it'll look like they should have concluded the exact opposite. If I say, I'm going to Tullinahaw, and Tullinahaw is not in Cavan, right? So I'll be in Cavan? What? That doesn't make any sense, right? You should have concluded the opposite. Or imagine changing the first one. So I say, Um, I'm not going to Tullinahaw. And Tullinahaw, I'm not going to Tullinahaw. And Tullinahaw is in cabin. So therefore I'll be in cabin. Again, that's completely nonsensical. It doesn't make any sense at all. It's exactly the opposite of what the person seemed to have been arguing was the conclusion. If you go back to the argument 3 here with independent premises, it won't work that way. If you change one of the premises to the opposite, sure, you'll have a worse argument, but it will still hold together somewhat as an argument. So if I say you shouldn't be afraid of snakes, most snakes are not poisonous, um, although they do bite without provocation. Um, well, the argument is certainly weaker, but you still have, at least you have a reason why you shouldn't be afraid of snakes. You still have most snakes are not poisonous. And the other statement becomes, it's no longer a premise supporting the conclusion. Now it's become a kind of an admission of, you admit one point that seems to make snakes scary, but then you say most snakes are not poisonous, so you still have your argument. So the premises in example 3 are independent. If we just, let's change that back. But in example 4, we have dependent premises. Now, the reason I brought this up isn't that I'm going to test you on independent versus dependent premises. It's just that I've noticed in the past, when I don't explain this, some students will ignore a dependent premise in an argument. They'll say it's not part of the argument. And I guess they're saying that because it doesn't need to be said or something along those lines. The statement that Tullinahaw is in cabin, well, it didn't need to be said, so it must not be part of the argument. But it is still part of the argument. And you can see that when you imagine the opposite of that being said, and you get this nonsensical thing. So keep in mind that dependent premises are still part of the argument.